Yes, hello once again. Welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, where of course we continue to do our very best to try and bring you more of those long lost classic dirt bikes from way back in the day. Now, during my travels here in 2023, thus far, we've certainly brought you some nice old classics and some quite rare bikes as well. And it looks like we've unearthed yet another beauty for you to take a look at in this next video. Now, this featured machine is a bike that is very rare and quite unusual due to the fact that it's a road racing engine that's been placed into a British Scramble's frame. So let's dive straight into that video now and take a look at Adrian Moss's Rickman G50 twin shock Scrambler.
Okay, so as I said, we like to think that we bring you the very best of classic dirt bikes here on my channel, and after putting in yet another few hundred miles on my travels, it looks like we've managed to come up with another belter in this lovely Rickman classic. Now, this bike here is the latest addition to Cecil Pearson's vintage dirt bike collection. And just in case you don't know Cecil, he's the man with that fantastic assortment of Rickman Jap Scramblers that we've featured a few times here on my channel. So this bike will certainly fit in quite nicely among all of the other Rickmans in Cecil's collection. So to begin the story of just how this machine all came about. Now, the bike's builder, who was Adrian Moss and is the current owner of Rickman Motorcycles here in the UK. Adrian told me that some years ago he was contracted to go and race at a classic motocross event in Stockton in California, and he was invited over by the legendary Dick Mann. Now, when Adrian arrived at the event, Dick Mann had already prepared a couple of bikes for Adrian, and one had a similar frame to this Rickman frame with a big Matchless G50 motor inside. So basically, Dick Mann had given Adrian the choice to either race the G50 or a British-made Tripsa, and so Adrian decided to use the G50. And to cut a long story short, Adrian did race the bike in 3 races and subsequently won all 3 on the day, and he just about fell in love with the bike because it was that good. And it was then that Adrian decided, as soon as he returned to the UK, that he was going to build a similar machine using one of his Rickman frames. And so when Adrian started the construction of his new bike, the chassis that he decided to base his new bike on was one of Rickman's Mark III frames. But this particular chassis here would have to be specifically designed to enable it to accept all of the parts, like the gearbox, the magneto, and of course that big, massive Matchless G50 Fourstroke engine, because this project wasn't going to be as easy as simply bolting in an old BSA B44 motor, because extra strong motor mounting plates would have to be manufactured to make it all fit together. Now, as is the norm on these Rickmans, the chassis is used as the motor's oil tank, whereby you just top up the frame with lubricant through this little filler plug, and then the oil is pumped around all of the important parts of the motor and then back into the chassis. And again, almost all of these Rickman frames are nickel plated, which is a much more preferred method than chrome plating, which they say does have a tendency to make the chassis a little bit brittle over time. And so once Adrian had the chassis all sorted out for his new bike build, the next step was to source the G50 power plant, and straight away Adrian was on the phone to his good friend Nick, who is regarded as the G50 engine expert when it comes to sourcing and building these awesome motors. Now, just in case you don't already know, these G50 engines were originally made as road racing motors to take on those big Manx Norton racers of their day, so these engines were never intended to be used in one of these Scrambles frames. Now, as you'd expect, there were very few of these G50s made, and some people even say that it was less than 100. So even that statistic alone makes this a very rare machine, because it's sitting inside a Scrambles and not a road racing chassis. Although when Adrian commissioned Nick to build this motor, he specifically asked to have a small valve cylinder head as opposed to the big valve head that's normally used on this motor when it's in road racing trim. But the engine is essentially just a single overhead cam 600cc power plant, and it certainly looks a bit of a beast when it's sitting in this Rickman frame. And although they say that these G50s were a little bit less powerful than the Manx Norton motors, these were still very quick power plants. Now, the carburetor that's fitted onto these G50 motors is said to be an Amel GP, which is basically the same carb that they use on these G50 motors when they're used for road racing. And I'm pretty sure that these carburetors are also fitted onto the big BSA Gold Star motors when they also use them for road racing. But as you can see, it's quite a big lump of a unit with a separate float chamber, just like those old style early carbs from back in the day. But having said that, it still works very well to keep this big G50 fed with its fuel. And to provide the sparks for this motor, it's a British made Lucas magneto that's gear driven off of the right hand side of the engine. But again, no fancy dancy modern computerized electronics here. This is just simple old school electrical engineering that was a pretty standard setup on a lot of motorcycles of the 1950s and early 60s. And so moving on to the big G50's transmission side, it's a 4-speed AMC close ratio gearbox that's on our G50, as opposed to the wide ratio box that these motors used when they were configured for road racing. And because the gearbox is separate from the motor, it's connected to the clutch and engine by way of a simple primary chain. Now, inside this primary chain case, we have a dry clutch and not your normal wet oil cool clutch that's found on similar machines of this age, but it still works exactly the same as a standard wet multiplate clutch, although it's still quite good practice to give that primary chain a little squirt of lubrication from time to time to stop it drying out, which I gather is what the road racers still do on these old motors with their dry clutches. But it was always better not to hold the clutch in for long periods, like when you're on the start line using these clutches, because these units can get very hot, which obviously isn't a good thing. Now, believe it or not, one of the big headaches that Adrian had when he was fitting this G50 motor into the Rickman frame was making an exhaust pipe with the right shape and route, so as that it didn't foul up on any part of the bike. And during that process, Adrian made 3 different pipes before actually settling for this final shape and routing through the Rickman chassis. But of course, no silencer on this exhaust system, just a good big bore straight through single piece of pipe that ran from the cylinder head to just beyond this rear swing arm. Besides, why would you want to tone down the bark from this wonderful single cylinder motor? Because it does sound fantastic when it gets all fired up. Now again, as far as I know, these G50 engines had magnesium crankcases just to try and help keep the bike's weight down to a decent level, and I'm pretty sure that they pumped out around the 50 plus horsepower mark, which wasn't too bad for a single cylinder 600cc motor, but they also had the nickname of the Golden Eagle because of this gold coloured corrosion inhibiting paint that was applied to this cam cover on the right hand side of the engine. But virtually none of these G50 road racing engines have ever been fitted into a Scramble's frame, so this is quite a rare project that Adrian's taken on. And so, as we move on to the front suspension of our Rickman Special, we have a pair of Italian-made Seriani suspension units, which, to be fair, Rickman did use to quite good effect when they built other Mark III machines for their customers. And for the late 1960s and early 70s, these Seriani forks were certainly used on a very wide range of British-built motorcycles during that period. Now, once again, the front stopper on our Rickman G50 is, as you'd expect, an alloy matchless unit, which, once again, is a hub that was used on many British-built bikes back in the day, mainly because it was so light and had quite a good braking performance for an old school drum brake system. But this front matchless drum is slightly different from your stock standard brake drums that you'd maybe find on a road going matchless bike, because this drum's fitted with extra wide brake shoes, which I expect would be to help improve the bike's braking performance when it was used for road racing competition events. And once again, at the back end of the bike, we have a magnesium Rickman hub, which nowadays is very rare to see on one of these Rickman machines. But once more, these magnesium hubs were all about keeping the all-up weight of the bike down to a decent level. But I've certainly seen many different Rickman bikes with various different kinds of front and rear hubs on them, but these original parts are certainly quite rare to see in this modern day. So to keep the rear of Adrian's G50 in check, he's opted to fit a pair of classic Hagen suspension units, which are basically a modern interpretation of what would have been bolted onto these old vintage bikes in the 1960s. And I suppose it would have been quite an easy option for Adrian just to go for a much more modern, up-to-date pair of all singing, all dancing gas piggyback units, like maybe a pair of Ohlins or something similar. But then that, of course, wouldn't have been in keeping with the classic looks of this vintage off-roader. But nevertheless, these Hagen shocks are certainly very well engineered and of good quality. Now, the fuel tank on this Adrian Moss built machine is more or less your stock Rickman fuel cell, made as usual from fiberglass, as is of course traditional with many of these bikes built down the years. But once again, this part here had to be specifically constructed for this machine, which it had to have this special cutaway formed underneath the tank just to help it accommodate that G50 Motors cam cover. So as you can gather, although this is still a Rickman built motorcycle, it's not made from the usual run-of-the-mill components from their parts department. Now again, the bike's seat and the rest of the bike's bodywork are basically all unchanged since the Rickman brothers of Don and Derek first designed these frame kits way back in the early 1960s. But it was just a solo type of seat, unlike some of the much longer seats that you find on other Scramblers of this period. But once again, these parts were all part of the chassis kit when you ordered one from the Rickman manufacturer, which of course you could have in any colour of the rainbow, but I must admit I do like this simple black livery. Now, up at the business end of the bike, the cockpit controls consisted of a pair of proper old school Scrambles handlebars, which of course had the cross bracing bar welded on and not the more modern day method of using alloy clamps to fix them together. Now, all of the other controls, like these Magura alloy ball end levers, are all period correct items from back in the day. But you certainly needed a steady hand on this gasser throttle twist grip to keep that 50 plus horsepower in check that the big G50 was reputed to pump out. And equally, of course, you had to be mindful of that dry clutch that was fitted onto the bike's motor and not put too much undue stress on it while the bike was running and stationary. And so exactly what happened to this bike after Adrian's 18 months or so of construction, putting it all together? Well, Adrian did tell me that he did race this bike a few times at various vintage race events across the UK and in Europe, and he said it was just a fantastic machine to ride. But sometime later, Adrian was then heading off to ride the bike at the Robbie Allen Memorial Scramble in Scotland in 2014, when he was then contacted by his lifelong friend and racing legend, the great Andy Roberton, to ask if Adrian was going to that Memorial Scramble, to which Andy then said that he would also attend, but he said that he needed a bike to race, to which Adrian then replied, "I'll just give you my G50 to have a go on." So anyway, to cut a long story short, Andy raced the bike in the vintage class at the Robbie Allen event, and he took the top step of the podium for his performance on the day. And actually, as luck would have it, I do have some racing footage of this bike in action at that aforementioned Robbie Allen race meeting. So let's take a quick look at Andy Roberton putting the Rickman G50 through its paces at Tinto Moto Park in 2014. But certainly on the day, Andy was racing against some of the top classic racers in the UK, so he was up against the likes of Peter Hollinshead and even ex-British Classics champion, the great and late Terry Challoner. But as you can see, Andy was very quick on our Adrian Moss G50 racer, and although he wasn't maybe the quickest out of the gate in each race, once he got that big Matchless dialed into this Tinto racetrack, it certainly didn't take him long to hit the front. And as I said, Adrian did race this Rickman bike himself at various classic race meetings after he'd finished putting it all together. But I'm not sure if he was as quick as Andy is here, but in this footage from 2014 you can see just how fast this bike is with a top rider in saddle. And this was quite a tricky track here at Tinto, with lots of elevation changes, with berms and tabletop jumps, and these were not really the sort of tracks for your old classic bikes with limited suspension movement on the back and the front, but Andy certainly still coped well nonetheless. But this memorial scramble here at Tinto Motor Park in Rigside was in memory of the great Scottish motorcycle racer Robbie Allen, who of course was part of that famous Scottish racing family of Jimmy Allen, Robbie of course, who we lost, and of course motocross legend Vic Allen, who is thankfully still with us and still active around the Scrambler scene. But this was Andy on the G50 in the first race of the day, and even when we moved on to race 2 it was much the same. As you can take a look at there at the man in the yellow, that was the great Terry Channeler, but Peter Hollinshead here, number 454, took the early lead, but it wasn't too long before Andy got the G50 moving and passing Peter for the lead of race 2. But Peter Hollinshead, as you know, is certainly no slouch on this SRM twin-cylinder BSA, but it didn't take Andy long to hit the front and take his second win of the day. But you can see just how quick this bike is with this talented rider Andy Robertson in the saddle. And also you have to remember that this was basically the first time that Andy Robertson had slung his leg over this G50, so he's never really had time to acclimatise to the bike or the way it handles. So for a first time venture on a brand new bike, Andy was certainly making this bike work. But ever since that day when Andy rode this bike, he's absolutely loved it. And even now he still refers to this machine as his baby. Such was the affection that Andy Robertson had for this machine. And you also have to remember that this, as I said, was the first time that he'd ridden the bike at any kind of race meeting, and it was still good enough to put him on the top step of the podium when he won both of the races in the vintage pre-1965 class. But for sure, Adrian Moss has certainly built a fantastic race bike in this Rickman framed Matchless G50 combination, because as far as I'm aware, this is the only G50 in the UK that's been fitted into a Scramble's chassis, as almost all of these motors, as I said, were used predominantly as road racing power plants. But as you'd expect, once the classic dirt bike community had clocked the workmanship and performance of this lovely bike, Adrian was then inundated with other customers wanting him to build a copy of the bike for their own personal use, although Up to now, Adrian's blankly refused, mainly because he said it's not that easy to get hold of the G50 motors, and also because he says that it was such a difficult bike to put together in the first place. Although I'm pretty sure that this bike will certainly fit in very nicely alongside the rest of the classic Rickmans that are all part of the Cecil Pearson Jap motorcycle family, and who knows, we may still yet get another chance to see this classic in action as part of Cecil's Rickman motorcycle racing team.